and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. So by way of introduction, my name is Simon Kitson and I'm the Smart Meetings Director at Maverick in Europe. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Harriet Shortt, who is an Associate Professor at the University of the West of England and also the founder and director of Shortt Consulting. Alongside Harriet today, we have Glen Wastyn, who's the VP of EMEA for Avocor. So welcome, Harriet. Welcome, Glen. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you. Before COVID was how people gravitate towards spaces for privacy and for territory. People they are inherently territorial. We are inherently territorial beings, and we sort of gravitate towards spaces that we can call our own, whether they're secret meeting places or it's by the water cooler, or we might meet a friend in the toilet or whatever it might be, these corridor conversations, if you like. And I call these liminal spaces. These are sort of in between, peripheral, on the edge sorts of spaces, like the corridors and cupboards and stairwells and that kind of thing. And I think that was really important pre-COVID. I think it's going to be even more important post-COVID, actually. I think one of the first things that we might see happen when people return to the office is that people will want to talk to each other. People have had this really actually quite traumatic experience, you know, but it's been a collective experience. So people are going to want to talk and share stories and experiences, and so I think the knocking into each other sorts of spaces and the informal chit chat as an act and a practice will be important, but spatially I think people will gravitate to those sorts of spaces in a way. And I think, and you mentioned education establishments. I mean, a recent project that I've been working on in our own business school, particularly with the groups of students, you know, they pre-COVID, they gravitated, interestingly, to sort of fairly ambiguous spaces. They were sort of kitchenette spaces where there's a sort of an island, a sink, some breakout spaces and a sofa and that kind of thing. And students loved those spaces because they described them as being a really nice balance between being professional and feeling like work and quite homey. We called it homey at work. It was, you know, there's this element of kitchen. This one student said, oh, you know, it reminds me of my mum's kitchen, but I'm near my lecturers and I'm near the people that are important to kind of for my work. So there's that element of cushions and low level lighting and sofas and that kind of thing. And I wonder whether post-COVID, again, that mix of homey, professional feel, that, you know, there'll be things that we like at home that we might want to take back to the office. So I wonder whether that will be an important sort of space that we might gravitate to, that sense of feeling at work but at home at the same time. Yeah,
it's kind of looking at working at home in the reverse almost, isn't it? Yeah. Exactly. I think I'll leave my kids at home though. I don't think I'll bring them back into the office. And Glen, listening to what Harriet said there, how, you know, we have this kind of traditional way of approaching things with technology and with large format displays in the case of Avocor, where, you know, we stick it in the front of the room and we expect everybody to gravitate towards that. Do you think what Harriet's covered there would impact the way we use and where we locate technology?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's two parts of this answer. First of all, picking up on the everybody wants their own space. I think there's going to be there's two tendencies. One, everybody wants their own space. Even at home, people are fighting for their own space to work. But I think in the past, it was consider that you had your own space at the office and the office decided what that space was. I think we're going to see a tendency where people are going to find a mix of working from home, working at the office, but also more and more the flexible satellite offices. I think what you said about the coziness of the workspace, think about the WeWorks of this world. They're already on that trend of making a more cozy, homey feel, and people can gather together in a satellite office or a flexible office, don't have to drive all the way to the city center, but can meet up with their counterparts somewhere in the suburbs, right? And so that's one tendency I certainly see and reinforce what Harriet said, and that homeliness, that coziness. The second part is as we progress back to work, I think what we've seen in May, everybody needed quickly to jump on unified collaboration. I mean, we gained experience in 2 months what would have taken a 5-year learning curve. Now I think people are more thinking, okay, we're not going to let this happen again when we go back to the office. Now we need to think ahead. It's not about what is needed at a minimum. Let's think proactively and what's going to be effective. And so we see actually 2 steps. One is we need unified collaboration in the office to be able to talk to the people in the satellite offices and at home. That's the minimum. But then people are thinking, how are we effectively communicating? And so getting your hands around the experience of collaborating with digital content, not writing on a piece of paper and taking your camera and taking a picture and sending it by email, but natively working on a PowerPoint or a shared Word or a whiteboard. That's going to be something that people get hands around with mobile stands and sharing content, as we discussed before this preparation about like the old school people driving around with their video cord at school, but sharing equipment and then capturing the data to then decide, okay, where are these machines best used and how can we then optimize the space for the needs of the employees, not we as an executive management decide on where the office needs to look like and everybody has to adapt. I think that's where the world has changed. Now the users are in charge. It's a demand generated use case, not an executive top-down approach anymore.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Glenn. I mean, if I think back over the years, I've had the pleasure of visiting numerous offices, people like Google, people like Microsoft, who've kind of had these cool, funky spaces that you think, do people really come to work and go to an environment like that? I'm used to rows of desks together and a partition between us, and I think, well, by luck or by judgment, I'm not sure, but those guys were really forward thinking with that way of working. And Harry, do you think building design will be impacted by these sorts of ideas moving forward? Will people recommission the spaces that they have today?
Yeah, I mean, I think now's the time to be doing your research as an organisation. Really, I think Glenn's absolutely right. Absolutely, it's the ethos of my own research is really bottom up, user centered, user engagement strategies. All those sorts of things are really important, and it's about giving voice to those users. I mean, in my research, I use photography in my research, participant-led photography. So whenever I'm exploring a workspace, and often it's a new workspace, so it's part of a sort of qualitative post-occupancy evaluation, if you like, and really you're sort of handing over a camera, or you're asking people to use their mobile devices to say, show me how it feels to work here, show me what it's like. And now's the time to be doing that, really, I think, because Glenn's right. There's going to be a hybrid situation going on. I don't think it's the death of the office. I think the office is just going to be different, and it's going to be differently used. So we've got the office, and obviously we're largely talking about knowledge workers here. So the office, we've got home, and we've got these other hybrid sorts of co-working spaces like WeWork, and then millions of them opening. I mean, I'm in Bath, and just down the road in Bristol, we've got hundreds of co-working spaces opening up, and you've got all these sorts of different spaces where people will work. So it's really understanding a little bit more about what sort of work goes on in what sort of space and why. So I think this is a real prime opportunity for organisations to do their research and to ask people and have those real engaging sorts of conversations where people feel heard and people then feel significant in the process of change, because there will be a lot of change. And rather than this top-down imposed sort of executive leadership is going to decide that we're going to need this many desks, and and often that's driven by bottom line, a much more sort of collaborative approach where you can say, okay, challenges and benefits of working at home, what's happened, how's it work for you, bearing in mind working at home during COVID isn't normal working from home.
No.
It's not business as usual. It's I know we talked about homeschooling at the same time as doing this kind of thing. I've had to lock my door. So my daughter's,
yeah, me too.
So everyone's had this like quite tricky experience. So but there's still research to be done there to understand how people have worked and why, and what they feel the office will be for. Do we really need to up the ante with understanding a bit more around the collaborative, increasing collaborative co-working sorts of spaces in the office? Do we need a desk? Because actually, I don't know, concentrated work will be done at home, but more of our innovative, collaborative, teamworky sort of activities might be done in the office. So I think it's really just sort of really getting down to the lived experience of those users and their everyday lives and what they see happening in the future.
Yeah, definitely. I think if I look back with hindsight, I mean, I've worked quite remotely for a number of years now. I wasn't tied to an office 3, 4, 5 days a week, so it hasn't been a massive change for me. But if I look at our wider organisation, I think it's 14,000 people globally that went to the ability to work from home within about 7 days, and that achievement was quite outstanding, really, both from a technological and a personal perspective, I suppose. And whilst we've kind of forced that on everybody, or had to force that on everybody because of the pandemic, we've all coped pretty well, really. We've still been able to collaborate. We're still selling stuff. We're still moving stuff out of the warehouse every day. So obviously the warehouse guys are not working remotely. That really would be impressive. But that way of working and that change has definitely happened and impacted. I'm going to steal a quote from one of your colleagues, Glenn, which I think was just brilliant. The challenge is to equip short-term spaces the challenge is to equip short-term spaces and immediate challenges with long-term flexible and adaptable solutions. And I really like that. I don't know if you could add some flavour to that, Glenn.
I know it comes from one of our colleagues, so I only have to say it's amazing. No, it's absolutely true. I think picking up to Harriet said and matching that with the quote, I think a qualitative analysis of what people need is very, very important. Also to get the buy-in, to get their experience of how they see an office. But for the decision makers, it's also about data. More whether it's return on investment, whether it's capturing the usage, whether it's capturing if your building, how your building is used, and people are more and more moving towards IoT sensors to capturing light and temperature and presence. And I think having those two, the qualitative and the quantitative, and merging them is really critical to make quick decisions about how to invest properly. And whether you have an IoT strategy in your building or whether your screens have IoT sensors, where you can match the presence of a room with the temperature, with the availability of rooms, with the unlocking of ghost rooms. I mean, there's a whole business case to be made about optimizing that space in line with the use case that the employees want, of course, those two. And the benefit is that we've seen it doesn't take years to do that. We've been working with one of the Fortune 100 companies globally on trying to figure out what is the return to work going to require. And after 9 months of testing, they've made up their mind that, I mean, in this case, not everybody's going to be the same, but in this case, in all their headquarters, every meeting room would be interactive. Because it's not only about video conferencing and bobbing heads, it's also about what do you need to make the decision? What do you need to be creative? Do you need a whiteboard? Do you need video? Do you need 3D renderings? Do you need questionnaires? What do you need in that moment to make the call? And so it's about content and communication. And so once you get your head around data quality, making the test cases, and then analyzing it, I think within 6 to 12 months, you really could find a good solution, knowing, I'm sure Harriet will agree, that there is no permanent solution. It's an ongoing, evolving scenario where you can say, okay, this year, this is what we need, but keep monitoring, keep reading, keep measuring, and then evolve your organization with the needs of the younger and younger generation, because they have other things that they want than we old folks want.
Yeah, I can't recall, Glenn. Sorry, whether it was you or whether it was Harriet that was saying when we were chatting pre this call about how Gen Zs or whatever the latest terminology is are used to touching stuff. You know, they have a smartphone. You know, they're happy to interact with it. I think, Harriet, you were saying that they would go to these liminal spaces and they'd be there touching away. You know, why shouldn't they be doing that on a larger screen and sharing information between one another? Absolutely,
yeah. I think, you know, what was interesting about our research in the business school was that, you know, it was pitched at, you know, cutting edge technology in teaching rooms, and it was in teaching rooms, and there was a big focus on the teaching rooms, and actually it was quite static. It's quite, if you know, it's still a plinth to the top of the room, you know, there's still a screen. It's not actually an interactive screen. So, you know, those students coming from school where the technology there was really interactive with their screens, probably looks a little bit archaic to them, you know, and there's a few whiteboards around, and that was about it. But the collaborative spaces, which, you know, we would have, that we've got some high backed booth areas down the side of the corridor, we've got single seating, group seating, you know, they were the spaces that the students talked about. And interestingly, in the study, I mean, we had over 700 images given into the study by about 250, 300 participants. Students didn't take pictures of the teaching rooms, you know, that clearly, you know, so it's just as much what people take photographs of as what they don't. What they did take pictures of were how they were working in these collaborative spaces, laptops, personal devices. And so it's sort of thinking about, as Glenn was sort of saying, you know, this flexibility of these sorts of spaces. How can technology play a really important role? I feel like technology was kind of forgotten in those spaces, but they're the ones that the students were using. So it sort of promotes, again, this idea of really understanding the user and really engaging with this. You know, I completely agree with Glenn. You know, one of our recommendations out of the project was to understand that space is not static, and our experience of space is not static, and nor is it of technology. And so it's this marrying together, I think, of technology and space, and appreciating that it's this ever evolving digital transformation, ongoing education of how people are interacting. So one of our recommendations from the project was to appoint a custodian for building culture and behaviour as an actual role, not facilities, not health and safety, but somebody who's really interested in and can help manage and navigate and educate the sort of social, cultural and technological parts of the building, and develop and change according to people's needs and changes in experiences, because each generation of, you know, students or staff, you know, will, you know, needs and requirements will change. So it's an ongoing thing, not a static one.
Yeah, do you think
maybe one thing, if I may pick up on it, because it's an interesting point. Many seasoned executives are thinking, oh yes, interaction, it's for the young kids and it's very fluffy and sexy, but how does it affect my bottom line? I think that's where we've done a lot of research on this, and actually interactivity is a real driver for bottom line. There's three key things people need to remember. One of all is engagement of the people. If you're in a normal meeting room, 10 people, 3 people will talk and 7 people will be on their emails and their phones. If you have an interactive session, more people engage, which means you get more brain power working and more people engage, but also people take more ownership of the problem. So engagement is better with interactivity. The second one is memorization. If you have an interactive session where people participate, they will remember more and longer what's been said in the meeting. So whenever after the meeting they execute, you're going to get a more aligned execution, which leads to better results. And then the third one, because you get in this interactive field different functions, somebody from marketing with visuals, somebody with a website from e-commerce, somebody with the finance guy with an Excel, everything in that multi-dimensional space, you get a much deeper understanding of the problem, a deeper insight, which leads to better results, to better solutions. And so also from that perspective, interactivity is really important, not only because it's nice to have, but because it's going to drive bottom line in the future. And people often oversee that data supports the qualitative experience in this case. It's not one or the other.
Yeah, great points, Glenn. I was listening to Harriet as well and thinking the way that the decisions are made or the decisions are influenced. Do you think it's going to be different people that will make decisions? I mean, for example, for us all to get those 14,000 people working remotely, the CEO said to the IT department, get it fixed, and they got it fixed. But coming back to the office, do you think it's going to be different decision makers that will have an influence over how you adapt the spaces, how you use the spaces, more people focused than tech potentially?
I think it's a really good point, and it's definitely one to reflect on. I think because I mean, I work in a business school, and one of our the big focus for us often is leadership development, and so what I've been hearing over the last sort of how long we've been in this, around a year, has been changes in understanding how we lead and how we manage people. And there's been some real good news stories out of this experience, where there's been some really excellent modes of practice from leadership teams that have evidenced just what people need, which and all the webinars I go to about leadership and management at the moment, everyone's talking about culture and everyone's talking about empathy, and they're the two words that really come up, centered around an understanding of people, and there are some really terrible stories about how organizations have not dealt with this situation well at all. I was talking to a public sector organisation some months ago when I was writing a book chapter about home working during COVID, and they're asking employees to take a selfie every hour or so to see where they are.
Oh my God.
So you get an email and they'd ask for a selfie, and then you'd have to send it within a period of time. I mean, it's madness, that sort of thing, in my humble opinion.
Oh, I agree.
There's a sense of, I mean, there's lots there, particularly around trust, particularly about a focus on not what you're doing, but where are you? And we're back in that really old-fashioned view around presenteeism. If I can see you, then you're working. If I can't see you, what are you doing? And that it's such an old-fashioned view, and it would be terrible. It's terrible that it's happened during this pandemic. I feel for all sorts of people that have experienced things like that. We cite many disturbing stories in the book chapter that we wrote, but then there are these really great stories where you hear about exec leadership teams sending out an email and just recognizing that there's a human at the end of that email, and that there is a humane workplace to be made and crafted, where there's an acknowledgement that this is difficult, it's a collective experience. I'm homeschooling too, said several execs that we spoke to, and have shared this experience. So there's a sense of empathy, creating a culture of trust and understanding, and I think that's what's really going to be important to take out of this. Organizations now can reflect on how they have managed this process, what really good practices were evidenced through this experience, and what can you take forward in terms of how we then manage our spaces, our offices, our people, and really, and the two tie together, because happy people, that's the return on investment, right? That's really difficult and intangible and really difficult to measure, but long term, in terms of return on investment, you want people to be happy and for people to stay.
Well, retention has to be the number one goal, doesn't it? I mean, the amount of money it costs to find a good employee and replace somebody, there's your ROI straight away in investing in some tech. But Glenn, I think you were going to add something to what Harriet was saying there.
Yeah, I was, because I think it's. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of horror stories about how technology purchases can go wrong, and I think a lot of hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars of IT have been bought that looked great and just sat there. And I think one of the key lessons learned when we talk to Fortune 150, Fortune 200 companies, the innovation leaders almost in all cases have a function that is focused on end user services. It's not IT, it's not facilities, it's not the CFO that decides. It's a division that looks at what do the customers, our customers being employees, need. And so it is really looking for the benefit, the usage, the quality of experience, and they influence, sometimes even call the shots on the decision, and IT executes. It's a joint decision, but the power of end user services, the focus on the usage, the focus on the ability for employees to use what they've invested in, because there's no return if nobody uses it. On paper it might look well. And so I think that's a great lesson learned for people that are trying to get into this post-COVID, is have somebody responsible to look at the use case. What are people going to do? How are they going to use the technology? And then what technology do we need for this case? And not just buy technology because it's a big brand, and then ultimately it just sits there, which is no use to anybody.
Yeah, I mean, I'm showing my age now, but I remember back a good number of years ago when projectors and interactive whiteboards first came into primary and secondary schools, and at the time I worked for a projector manufacturer, and we did amazingly well out of it. But what happened was the government threw a ton of money at the schools. The organisation that negotiated the pricing with all of the suppliers just drove the price down and down and down and down. So the schools got their hardware and software solutions, but they had no budget left to train people on how to use it. So guess what? The teachers have got this expensive tech sitting in the classroom that, I mean, most of the time they were using dry white markers on the interactive whiteboard. You could do that, but that wasn't really the intention of the technology. And it was criminal, really. If 10% less classrooms had the tech and everybody had been really well trained, the user experience would have just been a million times better. And it's one of those things. I think the government at the time felt it was the right thing to do to show that they were investing in technology, but not always for the right reasons, as you quite clearly put there, Glenn. One thing, Glenn, I mean, we haven't really talked that much about Avocor and what Avocor can bring to this. You're not here for the fun of it, I know.
No, listen, I believe in education of our customers, and it's up to them to make the decision. We are not a brand for every customer. We know that. We are a product leader. We aim at delivering high quality interactive touchscreens, enabling corporates to get out of the use case what they need to do. We're very open and flexible. Our architecture allows you to grow with your company, to design different use cases with the same kind of boards, the displays that we have. We have the IoT sensors on board, as we discussed, to grab the data, merge it into the Azure cloud securely to get the business case out of there, and the flexibility to work with our ecosystem of partners, whether it's different brands of PCs, of computers, different brands of cameras, audiovisual equipment, because ultimately, again, we allow the user to define what they want. We just make sure it works 100% of the time flawlessly, and it gives the peace of mind to the IT department, the finance guy, that there's going to be usage and therefore return on their investment. But ultimately, again, this is not about Avocor, it's about what does the customer want, and hopefully the conclusion will be that we are the best solution for their problem.
Great stuff. And obviously with the, maybe touch on a little bit more detail, Glenn, the Avocor Aquarius workspace intelligence platform. So that's taking all the data from the IoT sensors built into a couple of your products and then helping, as you say, helping those decision makers, well, validate their decision, but also make future decisions as well about the usage and adoption of the technology.
Yeah. And again, it's about, I mean, IoT is a very young industry, and it's about creating the business cases and the processes to grab the information out of the data, right? And so making sure that we have a ready-to-go solution that integrates with Microsoft's other applications, whether it's your Exchange server or whatever, that you really can find meaningful information. Nobody cares about the temperature in the room unless if you can save on heating. Nobody cares about presence in a room unless you know that a room has been blocked, nobody's sitting there, and somebody else might be using it. So understanding that those different scenarios is going to drive, as Harriet says, use cases where we will learn, do we need those rooms at the end of the hall that nobody's using ever? Or do we like a little bit more space in the creative area where people all the time are gathering around a mobile card and start drawing and using it? So getting that data, matching it with your operations will result in a better environment for your employees, which will lead to happier, more successful, better, more productive, and hopefully retained employees.
Yeah.
I think if I could just chip in.
I think you froze for a second there, Glenn, but
sorry.
Yeah.
If I could just chip in there.
No,
I think
it was me as well, maybe. Go on, Harriet.
It just occurred to me that as you were explaining how you kind of gather that data and why that's so important, that, you know, one of the things that I do to sort of fill a gap, if you like, is a much more emotional, sensory, lived experience version of a post-occupancy evaluation. So within architecture, as I'm sure many of you are aware, you know, often when the keys are handed over for the building, you know, there's about a year or so later, you know, there's a post-occupancy evaluation that often focuses on the real functional technical side, and that sort of that data goes to facilities, and it is how hot or cold is your office on a scale of 1 to 10. It's that sort of data, and it's sort of quite, you know, it's quite quantity, and so I guess one of the arguments that I've made in some of my work, and particularly work with architects and construction companies of buildings, is to marry that up with a much more sensory, emotional, social, cultural post-occupancy evaluation, so that you can marry the two. And it strikes me that why do we not have a technology POE? Why do we not have a technology post-occupancy evaluation to really, because technology is going to play, it does play an enormous part. But I feel like when it comes to sort of building design, and the more I speak to engineers and architects, you know, where's the big conversation about technology? You know, sometimes I wonder how much that might get lost. And, you know, AV is a really important part. I mean, I've got the sort of higher education buildings in my mind. And I'm thinking, well, why don't we have something very specific where we've got the lived experience of technology, and that we can do a specific POE based on that. So that we can really understand people's uses and make much better decisions about how we flex our spaces in the future. So I think post-occupancy evaluation in itself needs to be just kind of broken up a bit for key factors and functions.
I think that's a great point, Harriet. And again, my experience over 20 odd years in AV is that the AV technology is the last thing that gets thought about in a meeting or in a new office fit out. It's all about getting the network in, it's getting the walls in, it's getting the power in everywhere. Oh, and by the way, there's 3 meeting rooms there that need some tech, and it's getting into that decision-making process earlier, I think, than currently.
Maybe one thing to add, and that's a trend we've been seeing for years, I would say. I mean, for those that are in the industry, we've been seeing it for years. But I think now, with this COVID pandemic influencing the way we work so heavily, I really believe, and I see at least, that a lot of the AV gets merged into the IT decision. So where AV was an afterthought, now by using Teams and Zoom and unified collaboration, requiring power, Ethernet, the right lighting, whatever you need, security, that decision, what is going to be at the end of that Ethernet cable and how we're going to use it, becomes more and more an IT issue. So I see IT companies evolving more into AV, and I would hope that a lot of the AV companies extend their experience towards IT. Otherwise, they might be they might have issues in the future. And I think certainly something I talk to with my prime resellers and top partners is like, you need to think about what you're doing today and how your business will evolve, because your counterparts will require a solution, not just a screen, right? And so IT is part of that solution.
Yeah, it's a great point, Glenn. I mean, the long used cliche of AV IT. I mean, it's happened, hasn't it? It's there. An AV product is an IT product is an AV product. So it's and it's embracing that. That's the important part. I mean, for our channel people who are attending, Harriet, what couple of takeaways would you maybe give them about what sort of things should they be thinking about when they're talking to their end customers from what you've been talking about today?
I think for me it would be about, I mean, when you say end customer, I guess I think about user, and I don't know whether that's a thing in your world, but for me it's making sure that you've really understood the type of work that people do. And I just think that gets lost a lot of the time. You know, we make massive assumptions about what we do and how we do it, and then we create these spaces and have these solutions, and then we think, yes, but nobody asked me. That's one thing that comes up in my research all the time, is that nobody really asked me how I work or what's important to me. So I just feel in all the projects I've done, I just think, well, you know, why did we not spend time just following students, just hang out with some people, you know, and it's often that simple, you know, just to hang out with some students and just spend a day in the life with ... whoever it is, to really see like the mundane stuff, you know, the really annoying bits and pieces of, you know, when I'm standing in front of a lectern and I've got all this fancy apparently kit around me, when I stand there, I can't move the sort of computer on the arm down far enough to see the first student that's sitting in the chair of the table in front of me. And so it's things like, I don't know, I'm sure I watched a program once where somebody was opening a restaurant and the restaurateur sat in every seat to see what the view was like, how it felt, what was in the peripheral vision. You know, so because you always, you know, there's always a horrible seat, isn't there, next to a toilet or something, you know, you've someone with a rubbish view, you know, and it's a bit like that sort of thing, you know, sit in every seat, you know, walk in every pair of shoes and see from every angle. And then you'll just get a more nuanced understanding, I think, rather than making assumptions about the big stuff that people might need. It's what people are experiencing, I think, that's key.
It's a really good point. So it's having that ability to challenge the users, or the buying end user entity, shall we say, making sure that you're challenging how those users are going to interact with the space and ask a few more questions. And
ask why questions, not just what, you know, like really understand why, and be open to critique. I think that's, you know, sometimes we're all a bit frightened of, you know, feedback and critique. Actually, it should be, you know, this is user engagement. This is about having a really open conversation about people's experiences, and be open to that and be genuine about that. I think the danger is that we pay lip service to collaboration and consultation, particularly pre-occupancy or in design phase. Don't pay lip service to it, because if you've already made a decision, then actually you've already made a decision, and so say that. Or it's a genuine consultation where you can then take that data and do something with it and evidence how you have listened to people. And again, it goes back to that idea of being heard. People feel significant. That's part of them feeling a sense of belonging and identity to the organisation, which means they stay, they're happy, and then that's your return on investment.
Brilliant. Glenn, a few closing words from you on that, or anything else?
I'd like to pick up on that. My main advice would be, do not wait, get started today. You don't want to end up in another conversation in 3 months where the entire world is going to go back to the office and everybody's going to want to have cameras in their rooms, and there's going to be a 6 months waiting period because everybody wants the same product at the same time. Get your feet wet today. As Harriet said, if you want users to experience this, get a few mobile interactive screens, get them into the rooms. Let's see how people use them. Maybe some at home, maybe a few in the office, and plan today for what you need in 6 months. Because if you do not do that, come 6 months, you will be taken by surprise. You shouldn't, and then you have to start, and your competition is going to be long gone. And either you're on the wave. My parents always said you're either at the table or on the table. I'd rather be at the table. So advice to you, get Shortt at the table, get ready, don't wait, get experience, and hopefully you'll be ready when it comes to know exactly what you need to do with the input from your users.
Brilliant, really good, really good. Harriet, Glenn, I've thoroughly enjoyed that chat. I've learned a lot. I hope the people who joined us have learned something as well. Really, really appreciate both of your time and thank you.